if you mirror that, if you're listening to them and watching them, then they can start to figure out that they're angry and that maybe they're more angry than the situation demands. And if you listen to them, be angry for a while, which is very annoying, right? Because maybe they'll be angry at you. Then maybe they'll calm down and they'll start to differentiate that emotion into articulated statements. It's like, well, I had a really terrible day at work. Well, what was so terrible about it? Then they'll tell you a little story. And then they'll say, well, that's happening all the time. And then you ask them about that. And then they say, well, my boss is unreasonable in his demands. And so then you ask them about that. And you find out that the person either has a tyrant for a boss, because sometimes that happens, right? A real bully. And then the answer to why they're mad about the shoes is because they should change jobs. Right? Or maybe you find out that, well, they have no idea how to say no to their boss. They just say yes no matter what he or she says. And that means they're too agreeable. And then maybe you have to figure out how they can learn how to say no and how they have to sort of check with their resentment to figure out when they're being taken advantage of. It's like, it's very, very complicated. And it's no wonder people want to avoid it. But, you know, that's another sort of truism. If someone's overreacting, well, they're not reacting to that thing. They're reacting to that thing plus a whole bunch of things that are related to that thing, sort of. And they don't know what it is. And so then, if you listen to them, and they talk about it, they're actually thinking. Because what you might think when you're talking is that you think, and then you say what you think. And so you don't have to talk, you could just think. But that isn't right. Most people don't really think. Like they don't sit down and meditate and like think logically through a whole sequence of problems. The thoughts sort of appear in their heads, you know, spontaneously, sort of like a reverie, but they're not philosophers. You know, they don't have that kind of command of the language. And so then when they're talking to you, they're actually thinking. They're thinking out loud. And for all we know, maybe thinking is more effective when you say it out loud, because maybe I'm wired up so that my brain assumes that if I'm willing to tell it to you, to make it public, that it's more true than those things I'd like to keep to myself. And so one of the things you're doing in a psychotherapeutic session is you're just letting the person talk. And, you know, I have clients, they don't want me to do anything for the hour that I'm with them except shut up and listen. And maybe now and then I can just clarify something. I have one client in particular who's very isolated, socially isolated. And this person has come to see me for a long time. And they just want to, this person comes every 2 weeks. And what they want to do is talk about the last 2 weeks. And they want me to listen. And so I have to be engaged, right? I'm listening. And that's a communicative process, listening, right? Because your face is changing and you're nodding and, you know, you're reacting. So you're in the communication, but this person just wants to talk. And then they sort themselves out, you know, and figure out what it is they're upset about. And then that's good, and they can go off and operate in the world for 2 weeks. And that's all just listening. Well, just listening. Listening is hard, and people aren't taught how to do it. If I can listen to what he can tell me, if I can understand how it seems to him, if I can sense its personal meaning, then I will be releasing potent forces of change in him. If I can really understand how he hates his father, that could be a conversation that can go on for months. Or hates the university, or hates communists. If I can catch the flavor of his fear of insanity, or his fear of atom bombs, or of Russia, you can tell that this is a little old. It will be of the greatest help to him in altering those very hatreds and fears, and in establishing realistic and harmonious relationships with the very people and situations towards which he has felt hatred and fear. So, for example, let's say someone comes into a therapeutic session and they say, geez, I was just having a conversation with my father. I just hate my father. Every time I talk to him, it just makes me angry. And like that's a low resolution representation, right? It's like 1 pixel. Father equals anger. It's not differentiated. And that's a problem because like their body's responding as if this person needs to be taken out, like you might take out a prey object or something like that, or destroyed. Because that's what anger is like, right? Anger is sort of like, you're an object to be destroyed. And there's truth in that, because it wouldn't be elicited by the father unless there was some necessity for the anger. But it's so generalized and global, it's not helpful. It's like, okay, let's talk about your father. Well, how would you do that? Well, what did he do recently to upset you? And then you listen, and you don't give the person advice about what they should have done, because what the hell do you know about what they should have done? You might have to listen for 50 hours before you could offer a helpful suggestion. Even then, it probably won't work. So you listen, and then they tell you some stories about, this is almost like the Freudian psychoanalytic approach. They tell you some stories about what their father was like when they're in their childhood, and then a bunch of things that pop up in memory, and they start laying out the story. It's like they're laying cards out on a table, and they just lay out all these cards. There's like 1,000 cards, and they're all representations of the father. And then they sort of exhaust themselves. They're out of angry stories about their father. And then maybe they say, well, he wasn't all bad. Then they start laying out some things about him that, he drank all the time, but he always took care of us. And he wasn't an angry drunk, and he stayed with my mother. And, so what's happening now is the picture of the father is getting differentiated, right? It's not just one pixel. It's differentiated. And then you might say, well, okay, here's all these angry things. How many of them are still relevant? Like, how many of those do you have to deal with? And the person will think, well, these, 80% of these anger things are dead. They're in the past. And, 70% of these good things weren't good enough to make up for the rest of this mess. But then you get a smaller pile of specific things. And then maybe you can start figuring out ways that, or the person can start figuring out ways that those might be addressed moment to moment in new conversations. Like it's a strategic plan. What's the situation? What exactly is going on here? Lay it out. And the emotions are a great guide to that, because the first thing you want to do is everything that makes you emotional. Those are the things that aren't dealt with yet. They're not fully articulated. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a full developed representational system. That's why it's still emotional. So it's like your body and your mind come up with emotional representations first, and only as you work through them, which means to talk about them essentially, strategically, they don't even turn into words until you do that. And that's where I think Freud went wrong. It's those things aren't repressed, although they can be. They're not repressed. They just never made it all the way up to articulated representation. And lots of things are like that. Whenever you're in a bad mood, it's like, I'm in a bad mood. Well, what does that mean? Well, you don't know. Well, why don't you know? Are you repressing it? No, you're just too stupid to figure it out. And so then you got to talk to someone. I'm in a bad mood. And, how are you feeling? And they'll get all spiteful and tell you how they're feeling. And then, they start to differentiate it. Maybe they'll remember something that happened at work. And then you can kind of map out the mood. And that starts to loosen it.
God. Boone Hem. Dr. Peterson. I recently found out that my father was a former Khmer Rouge. Now, the Khmer Rouge exiled and killed millions of people in Cambodia. So this is a rough discovery. I feel hurt that he was part of the horror in Cambodia. How do I deal with this? Well, the first thing I'd recommend is that you read a book. And the book is called Ordinary Men. And it's a story about how ordinary men in Germany, policemen, were trained and encouraged to become cold-blooded murderers of naked pregnant women in Poland during World War II. And it's a horrifying book. And so you might think, well, why in the world would you read a horrifying book of that nature? And I would say because it will help you understand that people who did such things were, in Nietzsche's phrase, human, all too human, and might help you bridge the gap between the father that you thought you knew and the father that once was, and to bridge the gap between you and those two. If you understand that the sorts of things that your father may have been involved in, or the organization at least that he was involved with, if you understand that people, including yourself, have the propensity to behave in that manner, and that it's not something unique to your father, terrible though it may be, if it's part of the, what would you say, the eternal proclivity for malevolence and evil that's part and parcel of the human spirit, as the Catholics have always insisted with their doctrine of original sin, then that may allow you to understand the situation of your father better. So that's the first thing, is that you have to learn something about evil, and you have to learn something about how it possesses people. And you have to learn something about how it possesses ordinary people. And that will mean you'll have to learn something about how it might possess you. And that's rough learning. So you've got rough learning to do. And then the next thing I would say is, look, it was a long time ago. And what's your father been like for you? Like maybe he's changed. People can repent and rejoin the world. That the Christian idea, which is a remarkable one, is that there's no sin that you can commit that's so terrible that you can't be redeemed. Now, people laugh at that idea because they think, well, that means that they think cynically, that means that you can be the worst and most impulsive sinner possible throughout your entire life, and then conveniently, in the moments before death, repent and enter the everlasting kingdom of God. And unfortunately, it's not that simple, because to repent and to be redeemed is to truly understand what you did, to allow the parts of yourself that did that to wither away and die or burn away, which I think is a better metaphor, because there's plenty of pain involved, to chart a new course and to swear by everything that's holy that you're going to stay on it. And maybe your dad did that. And so in which case, your job is to find out how, even now, knowing something about the evil that can possess people, even people that you love, even yourself, you'll have to find it within you to forgive. If you determine that this man, with all the hidden complexity that you've now discovered, is someone you love. And so good luck, because that's a tough road you've got to walk there. So, but like I said, I would say read Ordinary Men. That'll teach you something that you need to know.
So I've been struggling with an idea recently that I was thinking maybe you'd be able to help me out with. Basically, in a recent interview, you talked about how myth is meant to reconcile inherent contradictions in reality, right? But I'm sort of stuck between two mythological or psychoanalytic ideas that I think are both really important, but they seem to have an inherent contradiction within them that I've been trying to figure out. So on one hand, you have this idea that there's times in your life where you have to identify things in yourself that are insufficient, or there's a problem somehow that you have to kind of have a controlled burn, or like a phoenix-like transformation where you discard part of yourself that doesn't fit or is not working. But then on the other hand, you have talked about this Jungian idea where as you become really, when you get older, you mature by reincorporating things about yourself that you lost when you were younger, or that you're trying to integrate your shadow, or you're trying to find parts of your personality that maybe you've been rejecting and try and figure out how to bring them into the fold or into the whole. So he's got this quote that I really like, which is, "I'd rather be whole than good."
Right.
So on one hand, you may identify something as a problem and you want to get rid of it or burn it off. But then on the other hand, it seems like the path to being stronger is to figure out how to put everything together.
So there's a one of the things Jung wrote about in his works on alchemy was an explanation of the prime alchemical dictum, which was solve coagula, which meant dissolve and integrate. Right. So imagine this. So imagine that
Imagine you had a fairly hostile father who was not very well controlled in his aggression. Decent person other than that, but let's say that. And so your reaction is, I'm never going to be aggressive. And so you've built a moral structure that's part of your personality. And there's possibility floating around outside of that you've denied any ethical, what would you say? You've stripped the idea of aggression of any ethical utility whatsoever. Okay, so what happens? This burns off, and then that comes back up. Now you still have to integrate it. So it's associated in some sense with Nietzsche's idea as morality as cowardice. Because one of Nietzsche's most trenchant critiques of traditional morality, let's say, is that most of what passes for morality isn't morality. It's just cowardice. It's not that I'm a good person and I don't hurt you. It's that I'm afraid to hurt you. And because I don't want to admit that I'm afraid to hurt you, then I say I'm moral, because then I can mask my essential fear and cowardice in a guise of morality. And that happens far more often than you would think, because harmless and moral are by no means the same thing. So some of what you're burning off, you can sit, and this is where Freud was such a genius, I think, is because he concentrated on aggression and sexuality, which are perhaps the two most difficult parts of a personality to integrate. Said that the hypersimplified morality stops you from tapping into deeper recesses of your psyche. And it's partly because they're primal forces. It's not surprising that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that you stay away from situations where they might make themselves manifest. But the problem is, by denying the worst in yourself in that manner, suppressing it, you preclude the possibility of the best. Because no one can be a good person without integrating their capacity for aggression. Because without that capacity for aggression, you cannot say no. Because no means, if you really say it, no means there isn't anything that you can do to me that will make me change my mind. Or conversely, it means I will play for higher stakes than you will. And unless you've got your aggression integrated, there isn't a chance you can say that. And if you did, no one would take you seriously, because they'd know it was just a show. So one of the most useful things that Jung did, I think, was to work on this idea of the integration of the shadow, because he was really interested in the idea of evil, right? Especially working with trying to parcel out what happened in Nazi Germany and during the Second World War. What do you do with the part of you that's aggressive and potentially malevolent? Do you just crush it? That's the superego response in some sense. Do you just put it behind you, so to speak? Is that a possibility? Or do you admit to its existence and bring it into the game? And that's, see, for Freud, in some sense, morality was superego clamping down on the id. And they were fundamentally opposed. Both Jung and Piaget had a different idea, and I think they were right. It's like, no, you invite the bad guys out to play. And so you're an aggressive hockey player, but it's disciplined aggression. That gives you access to a whole sorts of energy you wouldn't otherwise have. And then with regards to sexuality, it's like, well, untrammeled promiscuity doesn't constitute a virtue, but neither does unavoidable virginity, right? In fact, I think that's worse, because it also masks itself with virtue. It's like, well, you should be able to do things that you wouldn't do. That's like the definition of a genuinely moral person. They could do it, but they don't. And that's not cowardice. And so you burn off the things that get in the way of that integration.
So when you say dissolve and integrate, might it be a good way to sort of bring the two ideas together, that the burning off and the difficult process is necessary because the elements of yourself are structured together in a rigid way that is not working properly? And
that's what happens to Geppetto in the belly of the whale. He's so caught in his presuppositions that he can't escape, right? And so Pinocchio represents the new force. So it's very interesting. So when you watch Pinocchio try to rescue him, the first thing Geppetto does is confuse Pinocchio with a fish, because he wants something to eat. But Pinocchio is better than something to eat because he can rescue him so he doesn't need to eat. And then Pinocchio wants to make a fire, and Geppetto objects because he's going to burn up all the furniture. It's like, we don't need the damn furniture if we're getting out of the whale, you know? And so Geppetto, and he's old, so that's the rigid structure. That's the old year that has to die off before the new year can be born. It's a forest fire that allows for new growth, and that's how those things are put together. And see, and it's useful to know too, because if you burn something off, you might think, well, there's nothing left. It's like, that's not true. If it's dead wood, then you have room for new growth. And you want to be doing that on a fairly regular basis. That's the snake that sheds its skin and transforms itself, right? That's the death and resurrection from a psychological perspective. It's exactly the same idea. Now, we don't know the upper limit to that, right? Because we don't know what a person would be like if they let everything that they could let go, and only let in what was seemly, let's say. But you can see that. It's funny. We don't know that to some degree. You can see people start to do that without, that's not a rare experience. And people improve very rapidly. They can improve their lives very rapidly. A lot of it's low-hanging fruit. Like, if you just stop doing really stupid things that you know are stupid, your life improves a lot. So, and it frees you up. It also means there's an element there that's also associated with pride. Because people tend to take pride in who they are. And that's a bad idea, because that stops you from becoming who you could be. Because if you're proud of who you are, you won't let that go when it's necessary. You won't step away from it. You know, and then you end up being your own parody, something like that. That's also a very bad idea. You want to be continually stepping away from your previous self. And so, and I guess part of that too is that you have to decide, you know, are you order? Are you chaos? Or are you the process that mediates between them? And if you're the process that mediates between them, you are the thing that transforms. And that's the right attitude for a human being, because that's what we are. We're the thing that voluntarily confronts chaos and transforms. That's what we are. And so, for better or worse, you know, that's our deepest biological essence, you might say. And so you can let things go if you know that there's more growth to come. So Israel, and so he's also the father of Israel and the father of the 12 sons who make up the 12 tribes of Israel. But what Israel means is he who struggles with God. And that's such an interesting idea, because it's, again, a psychological idea. And that's why I said earlier that it isn't obvious in the Old Testament what it means to believe in God, because what Jacob does is struggle with God. And I think that that's a really good characterization of an ethical life, because if you're trying to lead an ethical life, that's what you're doing, is you're struggling. Like, blind belief isn't helpful because you don't know what you're believing in. Like, it's just not that helpful. But if you're possessed by the desire to orient yourself properly, but also confused by the existential structure of the world, which we all are, then what you're doing when you're trying to orient yourself properly in life is struggling ethically. And Jacob actually gets quite hurt. He wrestles with God, literally, and God dislocates his thigh. And so, you know, the idea there is watch the hell out, right? The thing that you're contending with is powerful, although you can contend with it. That's the thing that's so interesting. But, you know, you do it at some genuine peril, which I think is exactly right. But the idea that Israel, so there's Israel, the state, let's say, and Israel, the promised land, and all of that. But there's this more important idea, which is, again, a psychological idea, which is the state of Israel, which is the promised land, is the state that everyone who wrestles with God exists in. And that's not happy, naive belief in, you know, an eternally blessed afterlife. It's not that. It's not a wish fulfillment. It's to be actively engaged in life, in the difficulties of life, right? And trying to find the path. Because that's what wrestling with God is trying to find the path. And that seems to me what belief means fundamentally in the Old Testament, and perhaps in the New Testament as well, is that belief is expressed in trying to find the path. And that's an ethical struggle, and it's a real struggle. It's the struggle of life. So as long as you're willing to engage in that struggle, then hypothetically you have the divine behind you. And so I believe that. I think that's true.
Because the other thing I see is that the people who set things right so that the horrible forces of cosmic destruction don't do us in, the people who are trying to set things right are the ones that are struggling ethically. And that there is a redemptive element to that. And I don't think there's any way of being cynical about that. So thank you. We'll